Okay, so we're going to jump right into things. We're going to take our large sheet of paper and we're going to fold it in half twice lengthwise, and this is going to create our sections. Next, I usually like to cut around 1/2 inch off of the end just to make sure that everything's straight. Afterwards, we're going to cut the height of our book. For this video, I'm just going to make a small book, so it's going to be 5.5 inches high, and we're just going to use our X-Acto knife to cut that. Afterwards, we are going to cut the width. You can cut it with the X-Acto knife, but I like to use the back side of my ruler to rip it so that we can get a nice decorative edge. Make sure to save one folded piece from your ripped pages because we're going to use that as a guide for poking the holes. Now we're going to cut our linen tapes. You want them to hang off around 1 inch or so on either side of the spine. I usually just cut them by eye, but definitely feel free to measure if that's more comfortable for you. So we're going to take that folded piece we saved, as it's the same height as our book, and we're going to mark where we want to poke the holes. So I'm going to do around 1/4 inch in on each side, and those are just going to be a singular hole. And then afterwards you are going to measure out where the holes go based on your linen tapes. Now that the holes have been measured, you can poke them with your awl. Now that the guide has been created, we are going to use our bone folder and just make sure that the sections are flat, and then we are going to use the guide to poke the holes through the sections. Now it's time to sew. So usually I like to take an arm span worth of waxed linen thread and then add a little extra just so I don't run out. After a lot of struggle and a slight mental health crisis later, we're going to do a bookbinder's knot. So that's where you stab the thread with the needle and then pull so that it's tight and won't come off. So to start sewing, you are going to put your needle through the first hole. Once the thread's through, I sometimes like to take a little tiny piece of painter's tape just to make sure that it doesn't pull through while you're sewing. And I also like to sometimes stick the tape on my clothes just so it's a little less sticky and doesn't rip your paper when you end up taking it off. Now that it's through the first hole and all secure, you're going to weave the thread through the rest of the holes. Once you're done that, you're going to take your second section and you are going to sew through the top hole on the opposite end that you started, and then again weave through the rest of the holes until you get to the other end. Once you get to the other end, you're going to take off the painter's tape and tie a knot. And you can cut off any excess thread. Now we're going to take our linen tapes and we are going to weave those through Okay, so now that those are all through, you're going to take your third section and you're going to do the same thing, sewing through all the holes. This time you're just going to be sewing around the linen tapes. So once you get to the end of your third section, you're going to be doing a kettle stitch. So that's kind of when you go under the previous section's thread and we're kind of making like a knot. Now that your kettle stitch is done, you're gonna jump along to your fourth section, and now as you continue sewing, as soon as you get to the end of a section, you are going to do a kettle stitch. now that we're done sewing the book, I'm just going to do a little double kettle stitch and cut off any excess thread. Since the linen tapes are a little long, I'm just gonna cut them and try to make them the same length. Again, this is a part where you could measure if you feel more comfortable doing so. However, you don't really have to. You can just eyeball it. Next, it's time to glue the spine. So we're going to take our PVA, and I kind of like to do strokes back and forth on the spine until the entire thing is covered, just to make sure that we really get it in everywhere. Now that that's done, I'm going to put it in my book press. If you don't have a book press, you can definitely use just a heavy textbook or C-clamps if you have them, or just something weighted essentially. And we're just going to leave it for a little bit. If you want to get it all done at once, maybe wait 30 minutes for the glue to dry. I'm going to wait till the next day just because it is getting a little late. So we are going to move along to the headbands. You can sew your own headbands, however, where this is a beginner tutorial, we're not going to get into anything crazy like that. You can order pre-made headbands online. I can provide some links in the description below. If you find yourself encountering any trouble because of the kettle stitches, you can crop down your headbands just to make it fit nicely. One more thing I forgot to mention, if you do want to add a ribbon, you will need to wait to add one of your headbands. So we're just, for the ribbon, we're going to take a piece that is I guess for good measure, you could do twice the length of your book, or 1.5 times. And we're just gonna glue a decent amount of the ribbon to the spine. And then afterwards, we are going to glue the headband back on top of the ribbon. For the love of God, I cannot remember the name of this stuff, but it's pretty much a backing for the spine. I'm going to cut a piece that is as long as my book. I am going to crop it later because we don't want it to be exactly the same length. But just for now, we're going to do that. And we do want it to hang over the edges of the spine. So I think that's an okay width for me. And yeah, here we are, just cropping maybe around 1/4 inch off of it. Next, we're going to glue that to the spine. I usually like to put down a layer of glue and then put the backing on the spine and then add another layer of PVA. And I'm gonna angle my ribbon and then just put a lighter nearby, not touching the actual ribbon, just to melt the end so it doesn't fray. If you do decide to do this, just be a little careful. Now we're going to move along to the book board. We need 2 pieces of book board, and we do want them to be a bit bigger than our sections. So where my sections were 5.5 inches tall, I'm going to do 6-inch tall book boards. And since they were 4.5 inches wide, I'm actually just going to do 4 3/4 inches. Now we're going to take a piece of book cloth and we want to measure out in the center the width of our spine plus 2 thicknesses of the book board. Then we're going to just glue the book board down following the lines that we just created. Once that's been glued down, I'm just going to cut off any leftover book cloth. You want it to hang about an inch over, and then we're going to glue that down. I usually like to use my bone folder just to make sure that the creases are all glued in properly. Before you go any further, I always think it's a good idea to just put your book in and just make sure that it does fit, because nothing's worse than doing the rest of the process and realizing that you fudged up your book flap. Now I'm going to take my decorative paper. So we need 2 pieces of it. We want it to be a bit bigger than the book. So I like to measure where I'm putting the decorative paper, so I'm going to go 1.5 inches in. I'm just going to make a line so I know where to glue, and then I'm going to press down the paper, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. This just makes it so when you're looking at the top of the book, it is even, not crooked, and it just makes it look a little more clean. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the decorative paper and just trim off any of the excess that we don't need. I know my pages probably look a little wonky right now, but trust me, it's not actually going to matter. Once you've done that, we're going to cut very close to the corner, but you want to leave a tiny bit of paper, and I like to do it at a bit of a curve. You don't want to cut it too far away from the corner, because then you'll get what we call dog ears. But you also don't want to cut it too close, because then you'll have exposed board corners. Now we're going to glue these down. If you decide to do the top one first, just make sure you go with the bottom rather than the middle second. So where I glued the top one, I'm just going to go down to the bottom flap and glue that, and then I'll glue the middle one. And whichever way you do it on one side, just make sure you follow that same process on the second side. Now we're gonna create our end pieces. So I already cut mine, but pretty much you want them to be the height of your book, but 2 times the length of your book. So I cut 5.5 by 9-inch wide pieces of paper, and you need 2 of them. Now you're going to take one and you are going to fold it in half, and you're going to do that with the second one as well. I'm just using my bone folder to make sure that they have a nice crease. And now we're going to use some parchment paper. Parchment paper is a savior because it does absorb moisture, so it helps your book from not becoming wrinkly. So I'm just going to slip a piece under the first page, and then I am going to start gluing that page. And so I like to glue the page and then line up my tapes to make sure they are flat and straight, and then line down the backing, and then we're gonna put the folded end paper down on the book and add in another piece of parchment paper there just to absorb any moisture coming through on the other side. Now we're going to take the book and do the same thing on the other side. Now that that's done, I'm just going to let it sit for a couple minutes just to make sure everything's glued, and once that's done, you can take your book and take out the parchment paper because a little bit of the moisture has been absorbed. I am going to put a piece back in just in between the end pages because we're going to be gluing that down. And then here you do want to make sure your book's where you want it to be because you're just going to be folding over the cover and attaching it to the end paper and making sure it's snug. And then we're going to be doing the same thing on the other side. And now you want to put all the parchment back in. I'm just reusing the same parchment, but just make sure there's no glue on it. Once you've got all the parchment in, you're just going to leave it under a book or in a book press. After a couple hours, you can take the weight off and remove any of the parchment paper, and wow, you have yourself a case binding.